Hello and welcome to Hot and Heavy, the Elaine podcast. I'm your host, Shivani Desai. Today I'll be talking about Season 4, Episode 7, The Cheever Letters. Hello everyone. How's everyone doing out there? I hope everyone's doing well. I'm doing pretty well. Better than last week. I was a little bit under the weather last week, and I think it came out in my voice. I did not have the energy that you, my listeners, so deserve. So I apologize for that. I feel better today, so get ready for just a better energy, better vibe, you guys. While I physically feel better, I'm a little bit mentally drained. I think we all are constantly these days, but for me personally, on top of all the other reasons most of us are totally mentally drained every day, I've been watching / listening / reading a lot about scammers and people who are committing fraud or have committed fraud. And now there's podcasts and different, limited series depictions about what they did. So more specifically, I am talking about the Elizabeth Holmes story or the WeWork story or the, now we started watching that Bad Vegan docuseries, that whole story. So I couldn't really put my finger on it, but I was just feeling just gross. And I think it's really had an effect on me because, specifically for it's called The Dropout, which is it's the name of a podcast, and then the Hulu limited series is based off of that podcast, but it's about the story of Elizabeth Holmes, the disgraced founder, CEO of Theranos, the company that had promised to revolutionize the way blood was taken and all this stuff. Anyway, I had read the book about her called Bad Blood a few years ago, and then there was a documentary about her. So I've kept up with this story for a long time, and then I started watching the Hulu series, which that alerted me to the fact that it was based on this podcast. I was like, there's a podcast. So I listened to the podcast, whatever. This is all to say that I was like ingrained in this story, super obsessed with it. And then the WeWork stuff, it's this limited series on Apple is called We Crashed. So it's the story of Adam Newman and this guy who, those offices that he made, those office spaces where it was like you can rent out these spaces. Anyway, whatever, you guys can Google it. There's a whole story about him and just how like fucked up he was and his wife. Anyway, so these are all stories about people who just lie over and over and over again and have no remorse for it. Elizabeth Holmes did once she was on trial, on the stand. Of course, she had remorse at that point. But anyway, I think that was really having an effect on me. I was just feeling so kind of drained. And it's a lot. That's a lot of negative energy to be consuming so much of. And there's just so much of these stories out there right now. And this Bad Vegan one, I had to stop watching it because it was, again, just so upsetting. And I just don't really want to waste my time watching things about people who are just so awful. These are garbage people who are oh, and I forgot about the Inventing Anna. Yeah, that was another garbage person. I said garbage person. I'm like, who else? Oh yeah, Anna Dalve. I think every woman in comedy has an impression of Anna Dalve. But anyway, so yeah, I forgot about that whole thing. That's been in the mix as well. So I think I need a break from that. I have been taking a break when my kids and we watch, as a family, we've been watching this show on Netflix called Is This Cake? Or Is It Cake? Whatever it's called. Basically, it's about people who bake hyper-realistic cakes that look like objects that aren't cakes. So like a cake that looks like a purse or a cake that looks like cauliflower or whatever. So it's a fun show. This is what kind of, I think, the cleansing I need, palate cleanser, brain cleanser, whatever you want to call it. So that's been a fun show to watch. And, but yeah, it's like after the kids go to bed, then we turn on these terrible shows about terrible people and sit there shaking our heads going, how are people like this? I guess I'm just done with watching liars and cheaters. I just can't do it anymore. So, and then another great palate cleanser as well is RuPaul's Drag Race. So as much as I love to like sit and watch stuff with my husband, I think I'm just going to have to break off and watch my RuPaul's Drag Race by myself. That's that's really the perfect lullaby, right? Before going to bed. I know all of you fans of RuPaul out there of Drag Race. I think you guys can agree that what else can you fall asleep to more peacefully than that? My husband will watch it with me. He's not against it, but I don't know if any of you out there feel this way sometimes when you really love something and you're watching it with someone who might not love it as much as you. They're just kind of like, yeah, I'll watch it. And then you sort of feel self-conscious about watching it. And then also almost kind of bad that they're not enjoying it as much. I don't know. So it would be more stressful if I watched it with my husband, if that makes sense. That's just my own dilemma. I'll deal with it because he always does get bummed out. I'm like, you know what? I'll just take my laptop to the bed and I'll watch something myself. And he'll be like, oh, well, I want to watch something with you. And I'm like, okay, well, do you want to watch this? And he'll be like, And then we both inevitably fall asleep watching whatever we end up choosing anyway. So it's just hashtag marriage, right, guys? Other than that, I am recording in another space in my house. I usually record in my closet. In fact, I've posted pictures on the Instagram account of me in my closet recording, but today I'm in my basement. It's nice and quiet. I recorded something else the other day in my basement and the quality was pretty good. It didn't sound echoey at all. So I was just kind of like, this is nice and cozy down here. I have a nice chair. So I'm actually sitting for this recording. Usually I'm standing the whole time. So if I sound like super maxed and relaxed, it's because I'm sitting in a cozy chair recording this episode. And if I sound super old, it's because I just said maxed and relaxed. Let's get into this episode, shall we? The synopsis for the Cheever letters is as follows. Jerry and George struggle to write the first draft of their pilot script. George and Susan inform her father that his cabin burned down. Letters recovered from the fire reveal that Susan's father had an affair with John Cheever years ago. A worker at the Cuban embassy gives Kramer more Cuban cigars in exchange for Kramer's jacket. Ooh, some of you might know what that means later in the episode. And you're probably not that excited like I am. Okay, this episode is written by Larry David. The story, though, there's a story credit to Tom Leopold, Elaine Pope, and Larry David, but the teleplay is by Larry David. Those are details I'm sure didn't need to be clarified, but I did anyway. Okay, so we start out, I'm going to kind of do this in couplets of these scenes because we're kind of jumping back and forth. So the first, I guess, series of scenes are between Jerry's apartment and Elaine's office. We see Jerry and George walk in, and George is telling Jerry that he's meeting Susan's father, and they're also telling him about the cabin burning down. They're doing this on the same occasion. Jerry is like, wow, you are going to make quite an impression on him. You're meeting him and you're going to tell him you burned his cabin down. And George argues, come on, he didn't burn it down. Kramer did with those cigars. Then Jerry relays the entire backstory of what happened. You got these cigars from her father, and then you dumped them off to Kramer, and then those very same cigars burned down the cabin. It's pretty comical. George says, maybe we shouldn't start writing today. I've got so much on my mind. But Jerry says, no. We have put this off long enough. And it's not a big deal. I mean, it's a cabin. It's just a cabin. It's not like it's a house. George says, we could build a cabin. Jerry says, well, maybe not us, but two men could. Just real quick, I always like that they're very self-deprecating about how they're both not real men. I think that helps offset kind of what jerks they are. They might be really jerky and like even maybe have an ego to them, but they're definitely self-deprecating when it comes to how masculine they are. So I always appreciate when they make reference to that. George is worried about the pens and where he's sitting. Does he want to drink? This is classic. Like when anyone's putting something off, I think we all do this, right? We were just like, well, I don't know, the temperature in the room's not quite right. Or my socks feel funny on my feet. I can't start writing now. Anyway, they sit down, they try to start writing. They're both thinking. And George says, weren't you supposed to call Elaine? Yeah, okay. George turns on the TV. Jerry picks up the phone. I love this. It's just, they're both on the edge. All it takes is one little suggestion. And then they're completely off track. Jerry's on the phone and he gets Elaine's assistant, Sandra. Jerry complains to George, whenever I call Elaine, I have to chit chat with her assistant for like 20 minutes. And I just thought of this. She's the original long talker. She puts Jerry through what Elaine has to go through after Noreen dumps the high talker. So anyway, Sandra is the original long talker. So Jerry, in order to try and avoid this with Sandra, he pretends he's on a payphone, much like Elaine pretends she's on a car phone. Jerry says, can I just get through to you, Elaine, so I don't have to waste time talking to Sandra? And then he confirms that they're still on for later. Then we see Elaine in her office, and she's got a rubber pencil thing going. She's doing that little bobbing up and down of a pencil. Makes it look like rubber. It is, you know what? It is amazing every time you see it. So she sees Sandra walk by and gets off the phone. Elaine just point blank asks Sandra, hey, when my friends call, could you not talk to them for too long? Sandra, of course, says, well, why? Did Jerry say something? No. He didn't say anything. Well, he must have said something. No, I can't work for you. I can't. Sandra freaks out and leaves. And then Elaine tries to get her to come back and says, look, Jerry's under a lot of pressure. It's very hard being a stand-up comedian. Sometimes they don't laugh. The actress who plays Sandra is Lisa Malkowitz. There aren't too many credits that she has on her IMDb page. In fact, it looks like she may have stopped acting in the 90s. And I think she's perfectly fine in this episode. She plays those very extreme emotions very quickly, very well. Both in this scene and the scene with Jerry later, she's good at making her scene partners seem like total creeps or really mean. So I think she does a good job in this episode. So we cut back to the guys trying to write. They're sleeping. Kramer enters and wakes them up. Kramer is super upset. He can't play at the Westchester Country Club. So we get another backstory here explaining because he lost all those Cuban cigars in the fire. He can't give them to the pro at the Westchester Country Club anymore to get to play there, blah, blah, blah. And so he asks George, hey, maybe you can ask Susan's father for some more. He's like, I can't do that after you burned down his cabin. Well, Kramer can't go back to the public courses. He can't. Well, George says he can't help him either. So Kramer exits. George says, you know what? I think we've got a good start here. I'm going to take off. I need to get prepared for this night at Susan's parents' house. The purpose of this scene, of course, or scenes, I should say, of course, this is setting up the episode. We know Jerry and George are attempting to write this pilot. George is meeting Susan's parents and telling the father the cabin burned down. Elaine has an assistant that is too chatty with her friends. And, Kramer is lost without these Cubans. And my take, I'm not really a fan of Jerry pretty much re-explaining what happened with the whole cabin thing and the cigars. And I guess also with Kramer having to explain everything. I've mentioned in previous episodes how I love how organically the expositional elements of the episode arise. Usually it's done so much more naturally, right? Like we find out what's happening through a conversation that's doesn't seem too expositional. And what I mean is, someone's not just kind of listing off and explaining what the audience needs to know. It usually comes up very naturally, very in a more grounded way. So I was wondering why usually they do this, and especially in Larry David episodes, he is excellent at very organic ways of bringing up what the plots are and what the episode's about. So then I looked at the air dates for this episode and the previous episode, and it looks like they aired 2 weeks apart. So The Bubble Boy aired, and then 2 weeks later, this episode, The Cheever Letters, aired. And in The Bubble Boy is when all that stuff happens that was explained. So perhaps they felt the need to have Jerry explain it, Kramer explain it. At least with Jerry explaining it, you can tell, I think they do try and acknowledge that it's a little hacky when George says, I don't need it explained to me. So it isn't as if there is a lack of awareness, which I guess helps my dislike of that moment. I like the struggle George and Jerry have with getting started writing this pilot. I think any one of us can relate. Starting is sometimes the hardest, most difficult part of a project. So I love that they get into the little things that can cause a lot of procrastination, where to sit, the pens, do we need a drink? Do we need this? And the switch to call Elaine is funny as well. And I love how George just immediately turns on the television when Jerry picks up the phone. They are not in the headspace to write, even though they should be. I mean, I think that's very relatable, especially for writers. Now, moving on to the Elaine portion of these opening scenes, I love that we're seeing this progression in Elaine's career. I mean, she's still at Pendant, but now she has an assistant. She has her own office. That's showing some upward movement with her career. And I also love that this episode has nothing to do with a romantic relationship with her. This is purely about a conflict with a professional relationship, her assistant. And again, just like the men on the show, her issues aren't gender-based at all. They are stories for a woman that are not a quote unquote woman story or a female story. Even something as silly as that rubber pencil moment, it's a small moment, but I feel like it's pretty significant. And why I feel that way, women in other sitcoms were very often, I just felt like the killjoys or the fun governors. They didn't have silly moments like this. This is a moment of her with this rubber pencil. It's really just for the sake of being silly. So something even like that's so small, just a little moment, it really delights me because women in sitcoms at that point, and I'm talking about not like a quirky woman, not like a woman who was just there for comedy's sake, just a normal character, especially a female character, they weren't allowed to sort of just be silly for the sake of being silly. So I just like this little moment that they gave to Elaine. And apparently I read in the notes about nothing that was decided on set. It wasn't in the script. So they just decided hey, Elaine should be doing this. So I think those things they're so small, but they're really significant to me. I do enjoy the interaction between Sandra and Elaine. We established early that Sandra is very easily set off emotionally. It doesn't take much at all. She seems to be very sensitive. And I also love how poorly Elaine handles the whole thing. I mean, come on, you don't confront her right after the call from your friend that she needs to stop talking to her friends. I think Elaine may be very early in her sort of leadership role here, being a boss to someone. I can kind of relate. In my corporate career, I did have one report for a couple of years, and I was the worst. I was just a terrible boss. Not that I was mean or a bully or anything like that. I just wasn't great at being that guiding force that an employee would need. But anyway, we won't get into that whole thing. But kind of related to what Elaine had to do here, I did have to have a talk with the woman who worked for me. She had this tendency to have very loud personal conversations on her phone at her desk with her Bluetooth. So she'd be working, full on working, but talking on her Bluetooth device. And this desk, we all sat in this open space. It was one of those open concept offices. So not only was it distracting, but she would also sometimes be chatting about intimate and private details about her life, stuff about her trust fund. And then her boyfriend was sometimes who she was talking to. So it was so uncomfortable. So anyway, as her boss, I knew I needed to address it, but I didn't want to embarrass her. Now, fortunately, it did go way better than Elaine's conversation with Sandra. There was no storming out. So, it was good. I mean, she took the feedback and then proceeded to sit in her car and chat on the phone during work hours. So it was sort of a win, but then it was also a loss. I don't know. Anyway, so I can relate to Elaine here with phone problems that an employee of yours is having. All right, moving on. We are doing this other kind of series of scenes between the Ross's dining room and Jerry's apartment. Mrs. Ross, right off the bat, says that George looks like Henry's sister. There's a slight resemblance. Her son is a podiatrist. George has great respect for anyone who works with the foot. I think we're just getting the sense of what this conversation is like at this dining room table. Now, the actress who plays Mrs. Ross is the incredible Grace Zabriskie. She made her acting debut in the late 70s, most notably in the film Norma Ray. And wow, she has been steadily acting ever since. I know a lot of folks out there know her from Twin Peaks. Now, I never watched Twin Peaks, but I know it was very popular. People loved it. I was first introduced to her in Seinfeld, I'll admit, but later I also enjoyed her in Big Love. She was excellent in that show. Yeah, what can I say? I absolutely love her. I have such a special fondness for women in Hollywood who have such great success without falling into like the conventional standard of beauty. You know, Grace Zabriskie has a unique look. I think that's how, like the tactful way of saying it. And it's part of what makes her such a fantastic performer is that very fact. Her unique look just adds to whatever type of character she's playing, whether it's humorous like in Seinfeld or creepy like in Big Love. I mean, I love that. I love when women can take, what could maybe be looked at as a fault or, something that's not going to work in their favor as far as their looks. And then they turn it into just like their biggest strength. I just love that so much. And with Mrs. Ross, we know we will have many more episodes with both the parents. Thank God, they're hilarious together. And I'm so excited to start this journey with both the Rosses, especially Grace Zabriskie as Mrs. Ross. And she, just such a gift to the show. I absolutely love her. All right, back to the scene. Henry asks George how he's enjoying those cigars. Of course, we know what George did with the cigars, giving them to Kramer. But he tells Mr. Ross, I'm sucking them down. I'm puffing my brains out. And when Henry says, they used to roll those for Castro, George does a Johnny Carson impression, the classic, I did not know that. Weird, wild. Mr. Ross doesn't get the joke. And Susan has to explain, Daddy never laughs. Oh, well, what's laughing? What is the point of going, ha ha? What is that? Ha ha! They show Mrs. Ross just kind of laugh as George is doing his impression of a laugh. Oh, anyway, and then she has to chime in as well. You and your cigars. Wear some more lipstick. Susan starts in with the bad news. She's trying to get it going, but then Henry interrupts and asks George how he liked the cabin. We cut to Jerry's apartment, and he's so upset with Elaine. Oh my gosh, you told the assistant not to talk to her friends right after I called. Of course she knows it's me who said something. Elaine's taking full responsibility. I know, it's totally my fault. Can you call her? Dial the phone. So Elaine calls Sandra, hands Jerry the phone. I think Jerry actually does a really good job here. He's like, no, I'm a comedian. She thought I was being sarcastic. And while Jerry's on the phone, he also prevents Elaine from having any of those pretzels she doesn't deserve pretzels. And I'm sure they were rolled gold pretzels, the endorsement deal that Jason Alexander had at the time. So during the phone call, looks like she's been appeased. And she asks Jerry out. And he kind of puts her on hold and says, now she wants to go for a drink. And Elaine says, just go. Yeah, I think I can. Back to the Rosses. Both Susan and George are sort of passing the bad news back and forth to each other, ping-ponging it, if you will. Henry starts saying how special the cabin was. Just all this history of the cabin he's telling them and how his father's last words were, cherish the cabin. And I have for 45 years. It's like a sanctuary for me. And of course, George has to make the comparison to Superman's Fortress of Solitude. And Mrs. Ross has to say, I'd take a hotel any day. Susan again tries to tell him the bad news. Gets interrupted again by Mrs. Ross. Look, Henry, I spilled wine on me. So they finally get to it. The cabin is kind of, George, burnt. There is a fire and it burnt. The mother just starts laughing. Henry can't believe it. It's burned? Did they find anything? No, nothing. Oh, Mr. Ross is distraught. He just gets up and kind of slowly walks away in shock. George is trying to explain, hey, this is really irony and it's comical. Mrs. Ross totally finds it comical. We're back to Jerry's apartment. It's later in the night, and we see a half-naked Sandra storming out of Jerry's bedroom, extremely upset and offended by something Jerry said. He's trying to defend himself and saying, look, I was just trying to keep up with you. You were talking dirty. I didn't want you to be embarrassed. She is so grossed out. That was a weird thing to say. I think you're really sick. Oh, you said much sicker things than I did. So she's leaving, and Jerry says, well, you know what? Let's just keep this between us. No one needs to know. Oh, really? No, people aren't interested in stuff like this. Oh, no. The purpose of this scene, we see the progress of both George's plot with Susan's parents and the sort of intertwined plot of Elaine and Jerry with trying to appease this assistant Sandra. I'm going to focus more on the Elaine plot here. I like the interaction in the first little scene where she makes Jerry call Sandra. I especially like his flinging her arm away from the pretzels. She's been bad, she doesn't deserve his pretzels. And it's more of the sibling type vibe between them. So I think that's so fun. Now that scene actually was a bit longer. It was included in the deleted scenes in the extras. If I may jump ahead, I'll just go over that right now. So we start out the scene where Jerry is actually doing a get out shove to Elaine. She tells Jerry, yeah, Sandra quit today. And he said, get out, and pushes her. And at that point, Jerry thinks, oh my gosh, what a coincidence. Like, she's so annoying and she talks to people too much. And just the day I happen to complain, she quits. Wow. And so Elaine's kind of trying to say, yeah, yeah, she did. But then she does reveal that she quit because of the way Elaine confronted her and that she figured out it was Jerry. So that's where we pick up the scene in the aired version, where he says, well, of course she's going to know it's me. And then in the deleted version, the end is a little bit extended of that same scene. After Jerry agrees to meet her for a drink and he gets off the phone and he's just again, super irritated. Like, well, how am I supposed to even know who she is? What does she look like? And Elaine says, oh, she's really attractive. And the scene ends with Jerry kind of raising his eyebrows like, oh, she's attractive, huh? So maybe this won't be so bad. All right, moving on to the scene where Sandra storms out. That little bra shot at the top of the scene, it's pretty uncharacteristic of Seinfeld as a whole, but especially thus far in the series. I mean, you don't see women half naked. I do like this scene. I think it's really well acted by both Lisa Malkowitz and Jerry. And it's a really good setup for the next scene because it does leave you wondering, like, what the hell did Jerry say to her? And just real quick, just to comment on the other scenes with the Rosses, the vibe of Susan's parents is just so amazing. Heidi Sweetberg has some very, I think, good words of wisdom that I'll cover in the extras portion a bit later. But I love what she has to say about seeing these parents for the first time in this episode. I love their dynamic together and apart. I mean, this grumpy dad and like a bitter drunk mother. Again, I can't say enough great things about Grace Zabriskie and how she embodies Mrs. Ross with such mastery. I love all of her reactions, the way she just pipes up out of nowhere. Henry, look, I spilled wine on me. Oh, it's so dumb, but it's so well done. All right, so the next scene, we have a classic Seinfeld scene in Monks. Jerry and George are at the booth and, Jerry's explaining what happened with Sandra and how they were just drinking and talking and suddenly she's rubbing his leg. And he knows it's wrong, but he cannot get his brain to say, would you mind? George says, how can women do it so easily? They can get that hand off the leg, no problem. Why is that? I don't know. They're working on a whole other level. I love that line. So then back to Jerry's story. Yeah, we're fooling around. It's getting kind of passionate. And then she starts in with the dirty talk. George is so interested. I love how excited George is. And he says, well, what'd she say? Usual things, typical. How do I know? Give me some typical. What's typical? Jerry leans in and mumbles something to George. And George, holding the ketchup, squirts it at the end of whatever Jerry says. Oh, that's very dirty. That's absolutely filthy. And then Jerry says she starts talking about her panties. I'm gonna need some water here. And then I said something. I'm just trying to keep up. George says, come on, just tell me, what did you say? Well, I said, you mean the panties your mother laid out for you? We have this long pause. George is like looking around. The panties your mother laid out for you? What does that mean? I don't know. It just popped out. What did she do? She flipped out. And George says, well, that's not offensive. It's abnormal, but it's not offensive. And Jerry's so stressed. Well, she's of course going to tell Elaine about this because I talked her into getting her job back. So he's bracing for Elaine to find out. And then Jerry asks about Susan's father, and George says, yeah, he went into his bedroom and started sobbing. He did not see the humor in the cigars burning down his cabin at all. All right, then they're off to get back to writing. Now, this is a no Elaine scene, but I still wanted to address the whole panty remark here. There's no way I can not address what they say in this scene, because it's finally revealed after seeing Sandra in the last scene storm out what Jerry said. Okay, so I know they were going for a line that sort of has no way of being interpreted as creepy or offensive, but I do not think they succeeded with that. Now, in the inside look, Tom Leopold, who is credited as one of the story creators in this episode, in the inside look, he says that this very thing happened to him, and it sounded like word for word. He said this line when trying to keep up with the woman who was doing a lot of dirty talking, and that she freaked out. So I think they kept it true to what happened. So knowing that, I can't believe in all of the discussion about this, was there not one person who brought up that it is a really creepy line? And the reason it's creepy, this is my take on it. It sounds like something you'd say to a little girl, a girl young enough to have her mother lay her clothes out for her. That is why this line is so creepy. It's as if you're talking dirty to a little girl. So, I mean, to me, it's clear as day why this is creepy and why Sandra was like, you're really sick. And that was a weird thing to say. Now, do I think that Jerry meant it like in that way, in sort of a, sorry, but like a pedophilia way? No, I don't think that. I don't think Tom Leopold did either. I believe it was some weird thing that came out during this panicked dirty talk situation. Maybe Jerry's just not comfortable with dirty talk. But in general, I think mentioning a mother during any type of sexual engagement is very gross. But yeah, I mean, I've always thought that Sandra was not completely out of line by being creeped out by him saying this. It sounds like he could have been imagining she's a little girl, okay? And that's just disgusting. Now, even though they were staying true to like the Tom Leopold story, I find it hard to believe that no one could have identified that this interpretation was on the table, like this little girl interpretation, and perhaps maybe make the line completely inoffensive. Like it could have still been about panties, but just something like, I don't know, you mean your panties in your bottom drawer or some shit, like something that really just didn't have anything that could be construed as really creepy. And to me, the panties your mother laid out for you is a creepy line. Anyway, just my 2 cents. I've always thought this line had a creep factor, and I don't think it's how Jerry meant it, but I do think that it's pretty feasible that a woman would be very creeped out by a man saying this during a dirty talk session. Yuck. All right, the next series of scenes are between Jerry's apartment and the Cuban embassy. Jerry and George they're stuck. They're writing, but they just can't get past this opening scene, basically opening moment. So Kramer walks in and he sees they're working. He'll come back later. No, we're taking a break. They're waiting to procrastinate. And so Kramer walking in, they want him to stay. So he asks George, did you get more cigars from Susan's dad? And George says, I told you I wasn't going to do that. Okay. Kramer says, I'm just going to have to take matters into my own hands. Then he exits, even though Jerry and George are protesting it. No, stay. So we cut to the Cuban embassy. Kramer enters and greets the receptionist. And, he gets slightly distracted and does a double take to this woman sitting in the back with sunglasses on. Now, this is one of those moments that always makes me giggle. It's just such a great move by Michael Richards to just kind of glance back and then, what? Why? She's sitting like a statue. So it's just hilarious. Anyway, he asks the receptionist to speak to someone about something private and urgent. She asks, are you an American? Now, the actress who plays the receptionist is Vanessa Marquez. I actually remember her from ER. I loved ER. I was a religious ER watcher. She played a nurse on ER. Unfortunately, she died in 2018 under some pretty tragic circumstances. She was having what seemed to be like a mental illness episode. She suffered from a lot of psychological issues, and she was having an episode and ended up having a standoff with police, and ultimately she got shot and killed by officers because, as it was reported, she had pulled what turned out to be a BB gun, and they shot her in self-defense. And so just a very, very tragic end to her life. In fact, she even appeared in an episode of Intervention where she talked about many of her psychological problems, from depression to OCD. Very sad. She died at the age of 50, and a really sad, tragic end to her life. In regards to what she does in this episode, it's not a huge role, but I think she's very likable and charming. I've always loved the way she said, "Are you an American?" All right, so now we're back to Jerry's apartment. Jerry and George are completely sleeping, and then they're woken up by the buzzer. Elaine's the one buzzing. I love how George falls off the couch. It's hilarious. They're just like, oh my God, I can't believe. Okay, you know what we need to do? Go to the movies. Let's clear our heads. And Jerry agrees, yes, we should do this. George does mention he needs to stop off at Susan's parents' place. He needs to give Susan her sunglasses back, and Jerry will tag along for that. Elaine enters, so excited. Nice going, Jerome Seinfeld. Sandra's coming back to work. Jerry, in self-preservation mode here. Well, you've got to fire her. Yeah, I know. I spent a lot of time talking to her, and I concluded this is not someone you should be talking to. And Elaine's like, really? Huh? Back to the Cuban embassy, 3 men approach Kramer and ask what he needs. Well, cigars. Kramer shows one of the cigar rings to the men, and oh yeah, they recognize it right away. So yeah, he'd like to buy a couple boxes. Well, these are illegal in your country. Illegal, huh? I like that jacket. Here we go. We got a jacket watch. All right. Now it's been a minute, but we finally have another installment for Jacket Watch. Now, for those of you who might not know what Jacket Watch is, it stems from an episode of Comedians in Cars Getting Coffee. The comedian Neil Brennan, he was admitting to Jerry Seinfeld in his episode that, I never really watched Seinfeld. I just want to tell you this. And Jerry, of course, was like, I don't mind. I don't care. He's like, whenever I did watch Seinfeld, you guys were always worried about a jacket. I just found that hilarious. And so I decided to track all the jacket stories on the show for this podcast. So this is Jacket Watch installment number 7. And we haven't heard mention of a jacket since season 3, episode 10, The Stranded, where Elaine berates a woman about her fur coat. But now this jacket is the Kramer, I call it the Kramer Power Over Women jacket. And this jacket has been the subject of most of the jacket watches so far, including this episode. So this jacket has been 5 out of the 7 jacket watch incidents, but this will sadly be the last one for this jacket, as Kramer has now bestowed the Cuban man this jacket. And now, well, Kramer's just going to have to rely on something else to pick up women. The Kavorka, I guess. So, yeah, that is Jacket Watch for this week. The purpose of these scenes, the plots are moving forward. My take, most of these scenes comprise of Kramer having all the comedy with the Cuban consulate. Not much to say about the Elaine stuff. This scene was just to set in motion that Jerry is trying to cover his embarrassing incident with Sandra by trying to convince Elaine that she should fire her. All right, next we are at the Ross's apartment. Jerry and George are at the door. Susan answers it and says, I thought you two were working today. We're taking a little break. George hands her sunglasses, and she insists, come on in for a minute. She introduces them to her family, her brother Ricky, who's home from college. Hey, young fella, George says. What's your major? I don't have one. Well, you should consider podiatry. Nothing wrong with the foot. Then George gets introduced to her Aunt Sarah in the wheelchair. He doesn't look like me. The actress who plays Aunt Sarah is Patricia Lee Wilson. Not a ton of credits to her name, but I think she's funny in this episode. We clearly needed to see an actress that somewhat resembles Jason Alexander. So for such a small role, she actually does get some funny moments, and I think she does a good job with them. Mrs. Ross walks in, of course, drink in hand, and upset that Sarah's wheelchair wheels are filthy. It's just common courtesy. You come in the house, you wipe your wheels. The doorman comes to the door, and there had been a delivery, a box of stuff from the burned down cabin. Susan, inside the box, finds letters from John Cheever to who? Her father. And she reads one out loud. I fear my orgasm has left me a cripple. Oh, wow. I love you madly. Love, John. P.S. Love the cabin. Holy shit. George and Jerry want to get the hell out of there. And then Henry comes running out the box. He grabs it. Oh man, it's all revealed. He had a homosexual affair with the writer John Cheever. Sarah says, I knew it. Everyone's just freaking out. Ricky, Mrs. Ross, oh my goodness. And Henry admits it. Yes, he loved him deeply. And he looks at Mrs. Ross in a way you could never understand. Jerry and George finally awkwardly leave because of the movie and the time. Yes, the time. All right, moving on to the last scene of the episode. We're back in Jerry's apartment. The two of them are trying to get this going with the pilot. Then they come up with another line. How's it going? Beautiful. Then there's a knock on the door. Oh my God, they were on a roll. But it's Elaine, and she's irate with Jerry. Real good. You just cost me $429. Well, she explains she had transferred Sandra to another office, and she blabbed to Lipman about Elaine's long-distance calls to Europe. She was calling a friend she made there, and yeah, she's upset. And Jerry wants to know if that's all that was said. What do you mean? Did she say anything else? Anything else? So she just left without saying anything. Yeah. Beautiful. Anyway, Jerry offers to pay for the phone calls. She resists mildly and then says, okay. And then they smell smoke. And of course, where there's smoke, there's Kramer smoking a Cuban cigar. Kramer and the Cubans are out in the hallway. They're smoking cigars and about to leave for Westchester. And Jerry notices that one of the guys is wearing Kramer's jacket. Then they exit. Elaine asks George what he's reading. It's The Falconer by John Cheever. It's really excellent. John Cheever, do you ever read anything by him? Jerry says, he's familiar with some of his stuff. Jerry gives Elaine the check, says, we need to get back to work. And Elaine says, okay, yeah, I'll leave you two alone. Maybe she'll go visit her mother because she just bought me some panties and they're all laid out for me. Oh, shit. All right, the purpose of this scene, we resolve all the episodic plots here. The assistant dilemma for Elaine, the cigars and golf for Kramer, and finally, Elaine knowing about the panty remark. And my take, this is one of the best reveals of any episode in the series, and what a delicious moment for Julia Louis-Dreyfus. I'll talk about this a little bit more in the extras because she has a lot to say about it, but I think you can all guess how much she enjoyed delivering this last line. Writing-wise, it really does come out of nowhere, and it's delivered with such nonchalance, so enjoyable, and perfectly done. Okay, I'm going to take a quick break, and I will see you on the other side. The year was 1985. I was throwing a formal dinner party, and of course I needed various doilies to adorn my table. This was a fancy occasion, after all. When I retrieved my most elegant doilies off the top shelf of my armoire, they slipped from my hands, and one doily landed upon the lapel of my chic blazer. When I caught a glimpse of myself in the reflection of the glass door, I was so taken by how that doily looked upon my breast. I looked positively divine. That moment changed my life forever, because in that moment, I invented doily darlings. Hello, I'm Roberta Laganza, inventor of doily darlings, doilies you dare to wear. After that fated night in 1985, I got to work on creating doily pieces that would fit onto your existing wardrobe. A doily overlay for a blouse or jacket. A doily hip wrap to accentuate any skirt. Even doily headwear, perfect for summer evenings on a veranda. Doily darlings have over 30 types of doily adornments, sure to dazzle your family and friends. That's right, doilies are no longer just for your dishes. Doily darlings are also completely gender neutral. A doily can be girly or boily. Visit my website, doydoyjoyjoy.lace today and become a doily darling. Doily darlings, now you are the main dish. And we're back. Now, the extras on this episode, we had an inside look, a commentary, and some notes about nothing I wanted to go over. Now, in the inside look, I mentioned earlier that Heidi Swedenborg had some nice commentary about meeting Susan's parents in this episode. And she says how people would often ask, why would Susan be with George? And she sort of never had a great answer. But when in this episode you meet her family, it does make more sense, she said. And I liked the way Heidi Swedenborg said it. She says it's sort of this hub of dysfunction, and there's always room for another spoke. So I feel like she means, yes, Susan comes from quite a lot of dysfunction. So she's sort of attracted to George because she can tell, he would be another spoke in this hub of dysfunction that she talks about. So I thought that was a really elegant way of saying it. Julie Louis-Dreyfus mentions that last scene, that blow line she gets to deliver. And she says it was like being a magician with a huge toucan up your sleeve. They shot it about 3 or 4 times, and every time the audience went in just nuts, and that she loved delivering it and like shutting that door after delivering it. Such a nice punctuation on that line. And she would just stand back there enjoying that audience reaction, just absolutely reveling in it. So I just love that moment. I love that she got that. Now, the commentary was done by JLD, Michael Richards, and Jason Alexander. A few things I wanted to mention from the commentary. As I've mentioned before, JLD most of the time will comment on her looks. I think it's very natural. So she does that here. She says that she looks to have a roundish figure because she was just 3 months out of, giving birth to her son. And then Jason Alexander says something that's very creepy. And look, I know they're friends and whatever, but he goes, "Look at the hoo-has on you." I'm like, good Lord. Ugh. Both Jason Alexander and JLD mention how Jerry's acting just keeps getting better and better. They really enjoyed his performance in this episode. They all just cannot say enough great things about Grace Zabriskie as Mrs. Ross, just how fabulous she is. And then this cracked me up. It wasn't until the end of the scene where Sandra is storming out of Jerry's apartment that JLD realizes what this episode is about. She's like, "Oh, I remember this episode. Oh, yeah, this is where, okay." Like, it was so funny to me that it took until that moment for her to remember what it was about. Jason Alexander mentions that he really had to fight for that moment in Monks where he squeezes that ketchup bottle after Jerry tells him the filthy stuff that Sandra is saying, and that they weren't sure if that would fly because was it too crude, something shooting out of the end of a bottle. Then they said, yeah, you know what, let's just film it and we'll see if they use it. I admittedly have sort of a dirty mind, but I never thought of it this way. When I saw that, I was like, oh, I didn't even think about it like that. I think maybe because it's red ketchup. I mean, maybe if it was mayo or like a ranch or milk or something. I don't know. Sorry, that's gross. But wow, I felt very prudish never having thought of it like that, like an ejaculation movement. JLD of course, has to mention another thing about her looks, more specifically, the jacket she's wearing when she comes in that scene where she's happy with Jerry for getting Sandra to come back. She goes, "What is this outfit?" And Jason Alexander says, "It's like the doily cowboy here." And she's like, "Someone's getting fired for that jacket." All right, in the notes about nothing, there was one thing I wanted to mention. Jerry has a nice quote about how JLD was key to the series as the lone woman in the cast because it was her femininity that balanced out the rest of the cast. And that was why it worked. You know, she didn't try to match the men with male type strength. It was a feminine strength. Just real quick, I mean, I've addressed this before. Most of the quotes that Jerry says about Elaine or JLD says about herself, it's kind of all in this, world of saying like, hey, she just brings this balance and blah, blah, blah. But just specific to what Jerry says here about being a feminine strength, it's the perfect way to utilize the talent of JLD with just this general material that isn't gender-based is, really, that's to me the genius of the character. JLD brings the femininity to the character. And I love that her femininity is never represented as a weakness because it's not a fucking weakness, okay? So I just wanted to comment on that a little bit because sometimes I think that so often writing something as a feminine point of view or something, it's always looked at maybe as the weaker point of view. So I love that they just, you know what, we're going to write her storylines and she'll bring her femininity to it, but that doesn't ever mean that it's a weakness and that, it can be used as a strength. So, and I think this whole narrative of being feminine and, is weaker is just bullshit anyway. And I think that is changing. There was that beautiful campaign, I believe it was by Dove, where they asked young kids to say, okay, run like a girl, throw like a girl. And their interpretation, because they had been conditioned to think like, oh, if you run like a girl, then you run like, oh, all like prissy. And when you throw like a girl, you throw really weakly, and so that to me was just so eye-opening and really sort of sad. So that was a certain age group. And then they had these really young kids where this little girl, they said, oh, run like a girl. And she just runs flat out. She throws really well. Like it was just such a beautiful way to illustrate how we don't even realize sometimes that we were being conditioned to think of certain things, especially when it comes to being masculine or being feminine. And, it has to be this very binary thing. Like feminine means, ooh, prissy and weak and not as strong as the men and all that bullshit, So anyway, I went on a little longer from this little quote from Jerry. But it's just important, crap that we are, I think, hopefully getting past in our society. Moving on to Contributor Corner, Greg sent in some thoughts this week, and he says, while Elaine doesn't get a ton to do in this episode, she delivers as always in every scene. I'll limit what I have to say to her scenes as everything with George really takes up the bulk of the episode. I love how she tries to help Jerry out by letting Sandra know not to take too much of her friend's time and immediately tries to cover when Sandra gets upset. It's very hard being a stand-up comedian. Sometimes they don't laugh. It's a well-written line and I love how she says it. Agreed. Yeah, and I didn't get into how this was just Elaine trying to help Jerry. I did like that aspect of it. Next, Greg says, the way she even sympathetically pushes Jerry into going to dinner with Sandra is done purely with expressions. I think if she had known that this date would end in the bedroom, she wouldn't have pushed Jerry to go so quickly. He literally goes from being annoyed by Sandra to being in bed with her. Right? Yeah, I think it helps that Sandra is pretty hot. And as he says, she comes on to him. And I do like that they sort of address that in that scene in Monks too, where he's like, I know this is wrong. I know I shouldn't be doing this. She works with Elaine, but I can't get my brain to say, I think, he was probably just horny. I don't know, like you can't blame Jerry, even though it turns out pretty bad. Greg also says, I like angry Elaine coming in mad at Jerry. We don't see her mad all that often up until this point, and I love how it all stops when Jerry agrees to pay the bill for her. Okay, she says so non-combatively. Yeah, I don't think Elaine's going to refuse money, especially not from Jerry. And finally, Greg says, Elaine gets the laugh of the episode with the reveal that Sandra did tell her what Jerry had said. And the way she leaves right after saying it, knowing that Jerry is now going nuts on the other side of the door, is just brilliant. I like this is how the episode ended because so much of this episode was George either with the Rosses or writing with Jerry. Elaine and Kramer were given scraps, so it's good that they let her close this out. Totally agree. What a gift to JLD to be able to close out this episode in such like an epic way. I did love that. Thank you so much, Greg. If you would like to become a contributor to Hot and Heavy, please email me at elainepodcast@gmail.com. That's elainepodcast@gmail.com. My favorite Elaine moments, it has to be that last blow line. I mean, I love the little dip of her knees and sort of savoring the moment and just how she kept it to herself until the perfect moment to reveal it. Oh, that was showmanship. I have to say, that was Elaine showing a lot of showmanship. That is my absolute favorite Elaine moment in this episode. Probably one of my favorite moments for Elaine of all time. And yeah, again, just cannot emphasize how happy I am that they gave that to JLD. And my final notes, I kind of disagree with Greg here. I really think this is a balanced episode for all of the main characters. I thought it was actually really well done. I do wish, of course, we saw more of Elaine, but I appreciate that a lot of the screen time had other female actors in it. So Susan and Sandra and Mrs. Ross, all of them picked up so many of the comedic moments. So, I mean, if it's not given to Elaine, I am good with other funny females on the show having a lot of comedy as well. So, yeah, I think this is a really well-rounded episode and I enjoyed so many parts of it. And yeah, what better way to end an episode than Elaine getting a huge laugh line to a rousing audience reaction? Perfect. And I think that's all I can say about the Cheever letters. Thank you so much for listening, and I will see you next time.